Hi, I'm Gamma, and this is episode 8 of Exposing the Cult, a podcast in which we take a look at what once used to be one of the most inclusive communities, the LGBT, but has been infiltrated by the ideology of gender. As always, I like to start by saying thank you. Thank you to everyone who has come and listened every week, the new subscribers, new followers, all of you who consistently come back and like and share and watch these podcasts each week. I greatly appreciate you. If you would like to support me, you can go to exposingthecult.com and order merchandise. Last week, we read a Gays Against Groomers blog called Pride 1984. And after I did the episode, I actually reached out to the author of that blog post, Jude, and she told me that her spouse, Matt, is a detransitioner. So I updated my information in the previous episode, and again, I'm going to do that this week as well. I'm going to drop the link tree for that author as well as the GoFundMe. So if you would like to support a detransitioner, their name is Matt, and that information will be below here in the description for you. Now, I thought long and hard about what I wanted to discuss this week, and this week we are going to discuss the term cis and who's used it to describe cisgender, cisvestite, cissexual, what kind of people they were, and a little bit of a dark history behind those individuals. So get ready. I'm just going to give a little disclaimer to everyone today that in talking about cis and cisgender, it's going to lead us down a path which talks about something that is a sensitive subject, and that is pedophilia and paraphilias. So if you are not interested in the article that I will be reading, then I would say after the first article about Volkmar Sigues, that'd be a good time to stop listening. There's going to be a lot of things that we discuss that may make people a little bit uncomfortable. And it is from the New York Times article. So we'll read the Dana DeFoss article. We'll read this Volkmar Sigues article. And then when I start talking about the German experiment, that would be the time to step away. So on my screen, what YouTube can see and those listening can't see, we have the tweet thread that set it all off. James S's tweets, yesterday after posting a tweet saying that I reject the word cis and don't wish to be called it, I received a slew of messages from trans activists calling me sissy and telling me that I am cis whether I like it or not. Just imagine if the roles were reversed. Elon Musk responded, repeated targeted harassment against any account will cause the harassing accounts to receive at minimum temporary suspensions. These words cis or cisgender are considered slurs on this platform. 29.2 million views and 259,000 likes. Well, Elon obviously allows people to have free speech on his platform, but there is significant targeted harassment against anybody who is considered remotely gender critical. Gender critical meaning that there's two genders. There's male and female. That if you believe that, you are considered gender critical. And the gender ideologists like to use this term cis to basically describe anybody who's not trans. So if you're not trans, you are cis. And I myself have been added to lists like sissy hole, lonely cis woman, cis cultist. Yeah. On Twitter, like not a joke. Someone on a troll account added me to these and it was like maybe a couple of other people, but mostly all my tweets. So I think they might be a little bit obsessed. Just a little. I digress. Elon doing this was such a win for women and men who do not want to be called cis. And the fact that they're using it in a way that is a slur, That's why we don't like it. And they keep saying it's not a slur. But when you say, you're just a cis woman, your opinion doesn't matter, or you're a cis het white woman. No, whoa. It sounds like you're talking to me in a foreign language, and it sounds like you're trying to be offensive, and you're trying to use it in a demeaning way to put me down because I am married to a man and because I am Caucasian. Like, you don't have to bring race into it. There's no reason to, right? But this is that ideology. The cult likes to try to make you feel like you have to feel guilty for existing. And I've said this before on my podcast, and I will say it again. You do not have to feel guilty for existing, period. And this ideology likes to make you feel guilty. They think that because you are quote unquote cis, you're privileged. So you therefore inherently should feel guilty. And that's just not the case. I won't allow it. Don't allow it to feel that way for yourselves either. So let's talk about what a slur is real quick, okay? So to slur someone in the way that we're talking about would be an insinuation or allegation about someone that is likely to insult them or damage their reputation. And many people don't understand why cis is considered a slur, yet it's hurled at individuals like myself to attack us. When we say we don't want to be called cis, and you continue to say you are cis, whether you like it or not, you are in fact insulting me because I've told you I don't like it. Now you might be asking, Gamma, why don't you like to be called cis? I thought that it was supposed to be on the same side of, geez, us. Let's get into it, shall we? Let's get into all of the goriness that is cis. So before we get started into the depth of the different variations of cis, I've pulled up an article from McGill, the Office for Science and Society, where they say separating sense from nonsense. It's literally like in the header of their website. It says an article here, the word cisgender has scientific roots. While we're all familiar with the prefix trans, its sibling cis has rich history in being used in the sciences. And there's like an image here. It's a rectangle with a yellow line through it. And cis has 2 feet on the bottom and trans has 1 foot on each side of the line. We're going to not read the entirety of this article, but what I am going to do is obviously link it for you guys in the description so you can take a look more at it if you'd like to. But I'm going to come over here to this section where it says the take-home message. This is what they want us to understand about cis and why we shouldn't be bothered by cis, okay? This is the fundamental argument that the cult of gender ideology, the cultists, will use to justify using this term cis. The prefix cis comes from the Latin meaning on this side, as opposed to trans, which means on the other side of or beyond. In chemistry, the prefix cis is added to the name of a molecule when 2 atoms or groups are situated on the same side of a plane of symmetry passing through the molecule, like a double bond into 2 carbon atoms. In molecular biology, a cis-acting element regulates a neighboring gene when it binds to a trans-acting element. This is how cis has been used in science, and now they're trying to associate it to a societal term and use it to subcategorize women. See, in gender ideology, trans women can't be trans women. They must be women. So how do they differentiate themselves from other women? They call us cis women. So they have subcategorized and subclassed females, women within our own sex by using the term cis to describe us. And this isn't just happening to women. This is happening to men. Recall, the tweet that I showed you was from a man. I don't think as many men have been in this fight as long as women have. I don't think that they have received the same level of rhetoric that women have been getting. But then again, I was in a Twitter space the other night, and there was a gay man who came into the mic, and he himself had said that he found it offensive and a slur to be called sissy, regardless of the fact that they're spelling it with a C instead of an S. Because he, 20 years ago, if he was called a sissy, it's because they were homophobic and they were talking to him that way because he was a gay man who came off not as masculine, right? I mean, it's absurd. So now that we've talked about the scientific aspect of it, and again, this full article is going to be linked in the description. Mind you, it is quite clear that this website is in support of using cis as a term for normal men and women, the average human. But it had information that I needed, and I'm not one to only use specific propaganda-like resources. As someone on Twitter got upset about one of the citations I made. Listen, if you're not willing to cite and review sources from every angle, then you yourself are the problem. You're part of the problem. You feed into propaganda. Because we have to look at sources from every single side. And I'm sorry I'm going on a little sidebar here, everyone. But my biggest advice to you when you're doing research or looking something up, don't just look in one space. Look at everything. Because there's a truth, and a lie. And you're never going to figure out what the hard truth is if you don't look at each and every aspect and all of the different resources that you can look at to make sure that you have the right story. I mean, it's pretty easy. You cannot disregard something because, oh, well, that's a MAGA resource. How could you be using that? Really? Oh, that website's all women. It looks like it's just TERFs. Well, women are talking about stories because nobody else will, so they made their own website. That's not propaganda. That's literally people's trying to speak up against what's being paid and forced into our lives that we haven't asked for. There would need to be certain sites that aren't within the normal media if the normal media wasn't hiding things from us, right? Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and drop this in the description. Now we've talked about the science. Let's talk about cisgender, and we're going to work our way back, okay? Hold on. Now, who better to tell us about the term cisgender than she herself, Dana DeFoss? We're going to read an article called I Coined the Term Cisgender 29 Years Ago by Dana together. And then we're going to look into cis and how it's been used in other instances. And we'll figure out exactly why we don't like the term together. So, this is from the HuffPost Personal. And it says, I coined the term cisgender 29 years ago. Here's what this controversial word really means. Before now, I have not spoken publicly or even disclosed my role in the origin of the word cisgender to anyone beyond a few close friends and colleagues. I coined the term cisgender in 1994. Nearly 3 decades later, the word has had ramifications I never dreamed of. It began innocently enough. I was in graduate school and writing a paper on the health of trans adolescents. I put a post on Alt Transgender to ask for views on transphobia and inclusion on the campus at the University of Minnesota. I was struggling because there did not seem to be a way to describe people who were not transgender without inescapably couching them in normalcy and making transgender identity automatically the other. I knew that in chemistry, molecules with atoms grouped on the same side were all labeled with the Latin prefix cis, while molecules with atoms grouped on the opposite sides are referred to as trans. So, cisgender, it seemed like a no-brainer. I had no idea that hitting enter on that post would start an etymological time bomb ticking. It took years for the term to take off, and it wasn't until 2016 that it entered both the Oxford English Dictionary and Merriam-Webster Dictionary, both attributed the origin of the word to my 1994 post. At first, I found the viral use of cisgender surprising, but did not give it much thought. It is obvious now that its use isn't a fad. That hit home for me in 2022 when I saw that the Supreme Court of Indiana defined the legal term women as including other than cisgender women. The word cisgender is now an influential force in culture, sexuality, law, and medicine around the world. I'm going to pause for a second. Women are adult human females. We should not be categorized as anything but what we biologically are. We are a protected sex class, and the fact that it was a woman who used this term cisgender is deeply offensive. That she has made us second class to men who call themselves women. But I'll continue the article. Before now, I have not spoken publicly or even disclosed my role in the origin of the word cisgender to anyone beyond a few close friends and colleagues. Although I've not yet experienced personal attacks for being associated with its creation, it is painful when people imply that it was intended to hurt others. I never believed that adding the word to the lexicon caused problems. It only revealed them. Whatever the fate of the word, I feel compelled to speak out against the idea that it was hateful. Even though I never predicted it, the word cisgender is now at the center of a minor maelstrom. Across social media, people say they resent being labeled or having an unwanted term forced on them. Some call cisgender a slur, as in, I'm not cis, I'm normal. What should be an innocuous term has spawned Twitter storms from celebrities like William Shatner, who said he feels debased and hated by the use of the term. Cisgender privilege was even the topic of a South Park episode, Sissy. Even some in LGBTQ+ communities have condemned the term cisgender as perpetuating binary constraints on gender. It saddens me to hear that people feel harmed by the word cisgender. Is the creation of the word to blame? No. Cisgender is just a straw man. It is easier to attack a word than to address the reasons people feel intimidated by discussions of gender identity. The word is a threat because it linguistically separates biological sex from socially constructed categories of woman and man. That gender is a social construction undermines heteronormativity. Critical to defending patriarchal sex roles and procreation, it is not surprising that those who have garnered dominance and privilege from their traditional gender roles feel threatened and compelled to lash out. These ideas are not new, but the word cisgender repackages them in a way that is more potent and visceral. I'm going to pause. What about the lesbians who don't want to be called cisgendered? What about the gay men who do not want to be called cisgendered? What you are doing is eradicating butch lesbians, effeminate men, femboys. You are saying that if someone is outside of the binary of their gender role, then essentially they must be trans. That's what this ideology is doing. That's what this entire article is doing. Because she wants to sit here and say that it's heteronormativity. It's a social construction of heteronormativity, okay? But it's not just the heteronormative people like myself who are having problems. It's the gay men in Twitter spaces saying, I haven't been called sissy in 20 years. Just because it's with a C instead of an S doesn't mean that it's any less dehumanizing. To say that a gay man would have to be trans because he's too, quote unquote, feminine to be a man is inherently homophobic. Cisgender is a homophobic term, and it's based in homophobia. And trying to use heteronormativity to cater to people who are so far gone in the ideology and make it seem like, yeah, exactly. You're completely ignoring the entire LGBT community, the entirety of it. Young girls who would grow up to be more butchy lesbians, and I'm only using the term butch in that manner because I've talked with lesbians who identify as butch lesbians, and they themselves have said that gender ideology is eradicating young lesbians who might be a little more masculine leaning or project themselves in a non-gender conforming way. and that this ideology is telling them, well, honey, you must be a man. So you should take puberty blockers. You should take testosterone. Then you'll be perfectly fine. This is not okay. But we'll continue Miss DeFoss's article, shall we? Today, enforcers of what I call cis purity, oh, that's a new one for me, everybody, are interviewing in ways reminiscent of historical measures to eliminate target groups based on identity. In a recent campaign speech, Donald Trump called gender-affirming care child sexual mutilation and vowed to use federal agencies and police to enforce its prohibition. If reelected, he promises to pass legislation that codifies the identities of Americans as only cisgender males or females. Such a law would erase the legal existence of trans people, those who are intersex, and any other gender nonconforming individuals. Pause. Gamma's thoughts now. Okay. He did not say he's only going to identify them as cisgendered male or females. That's you putting words in his mouth. He said biological sex, male or female. Cisgender is not a necessary word that you're trying to force us to adopt. This is a cult terminology. This isn't 1984. We are not in an Orwellian society, although you guys are trying to make it as such. We are men and we are women. And if you are trans, you are a trans man or a trans woman. But that does not mean that you are a category of women or a category of man. You are still within your biological sex. Trans women are a category of men. Blair White said this, and I completely agree. Shout out to you, Blair. I think that you're fantastic. But let's continue this article, shall we? Several U.S. states are introducing legislation to prohibit drag performances. Tennessee Senate Majority Leader Jack Johnson recently introduced legislation to criminalize drag performances in public spaces. Second-time offenders would be charged with a felony with a prison sentence of up to 6 years. As draconian as these laws sound, I am more concerned that they are so vague they will threaten transgender women and others under the sweeping definition of female impersonator. Okay. Thoughts on this little section here. It's not prohibiting drag performances. They've categorized them in the same way that they do strip clubs for women. Women cannot strip in front of children in the open. They have to be in an 18 and up location, a private establishment. There should be no reason for twerking and dancing and stripping and gyrating on a child. These things should not happen. Don't tell me they don't happen, because they do, and there's plenty of videos on the internet for you to watch. Okay. The past has shown that the first stage of erasing people is to eradicate their history, culture, and literature. As a library worker, today's culture conf horrifies me, and I fear for my colleagues. Reactionaries attack libraries with intimidation, guns, defunding, and even proposed librarians be jailed for refusing to comply with anti-LGBT book bans. The entire full-time staff of a library in Iowa resigned over harassment for cataloging books LGBTQ plus content. If militant anti-LGBTQ plus individuals can ban books, what's stopping them from going after LGBTQ plus content on library computers? Will I soon be expected to prohibit library patrons from using computers to read a HuffPost article on the LGBTQ lives? Okay, Dana. Wow. Let's talk about those books, right? You're talking about the books where it's for K through 8th and they're talking about masturbation and they have graphic images of said masturbation. There's a video. I'll link it in the description. I sing the song Garden of Shadows. There's imagery on there. I've tweeted it, so it's on Twitter. It's on my TikToks. It's on Instagram, and it's here on YouTube. There are numerous images that you can watch and see from these books that do need to be banned because we should not be hypersexualizing children or teaching them about masturbation before they've even had puberty. That should be a given. A given. But Dana DeVos here, who created the term cisgender, well, she thinks that's just terrible to prevent children from seeing information like that, right? How dare we prevent children who are innocent and don't understand sex from looking at images that might make them a little too curious for a 5 to 7-year-old, right? But we're the problem. Okay. She says, what troubles me even more than expunging trans voices is depriving trans people of life-saving therapies. As the war on women's autonomy, healthcare providers caring for trans kids are intimidated by threats of violence and criminal liability meant to usurp the sacrosanct bond between the doctor and the patient that has existed since Hippocrates. It is beyond hypocritical that those claiming to support families would strip parents of their right to decide about their children's health and well-being. Hold on. What about how in Washington, if you don't gender affirm your child, they'll take your child away? What about in California? If you don't gender affirm your child, they'll take your child away. Parental rights matter. Parents protect their children not only from the dangers of day-to-day society, but from the dangers of government. That is why children don't have the same rights as adults, because they need guidance and they need parents who are right-minded to protect them from indoctrination into ideologies. And I can't believe how absolutely blind this article is for someone who wants to sit here and talk about concern for women and children, and yet she's sitting here promoting all trans ideology, just promoting gender ideology. In a recent peer-reviewed study, 56% of trans adolescents have attempted suicide at least once, and 86% have considered it. A study published in the journal Pediatrics showed that trans and non-binary teens who received gender-affirming care had a 73% lower likelihood of considering suicide. All major healthcare associations in the United States recognize the need for evidence-based, gender-affirming medical care. I'm just going to point out that this article is outdated because they actually came out with new statistics. I don't have those on hand right now, but hold me to it in the comments, and I'm going to be pulling up those statistics for next podcast episode, just so we can tie that in a nice bow. In January, the U.S. state of Utah was the first this year to ban gender-affirming care for trans youth. And at least 21 additional states have proposed similar bills in 2023. Any rational policymaker could only conclude that legislation depriving trans kids of gender-affirming medical care will trigger more tragic loss of life. It's gaslighting at its worst to claim to be protecting kids by enacting policies that virtually ensure greater mortal risk. I've known too many trans people that were lost to suicide. No one should have to get one of those 3 a.m. calls, worst of all, a parent. Oh my God, gaslighting? Dana! You're gaslighting. You're using emotional manipulation and narcissism. And you're saying that if they don't get their care, they will die. They will kill themselves. Why do you think that is? Do you think that maybe teaching children that, listen, guys, if you don't get your gender affirming care, you're more likely to kill yourself. So you should definitely try to get this care. And you're confused. You're going through body dysphoria and dysmorphia, which, by the way, it is proven that puberty cures like over 80% of gender dysmorphia, dysphoria. There is still a percentage of people who suffer after the fact, but I digress. This is gaslighting. This article is gaslighting. Maybe you should look up the definition. Wow. As if putting kids at risk of self-harm wasn't enough, there are some who openly use language that incites violence against trans people. With a page from the playbook of history's purity defenders, elected officials espouse thinly coded rhetoric that fuels violence, while keeping their hands clean of the weekly homicides and suicides that devastate trans communities and their families. Sometimes the rhetoric is not so subtle. Elizabeth Lancaster, a Santa Rosa County, Florida school board candidate endorsed by the local Republican Party, said that doctors caring for trans kids should be hanging from the nearest tree. Pastors in Texas and Idaho have openly called for the assassination of LGBTQ individuals. James Slaw was a patron at Club Q in Colorado Springs, Colorado, when a mass shooting killed 5 people and injured 7. The town is the home to Focus on the Family, a font of anti-LGBTQ plus narratives with a $500 million war chest for political influence across the United States. In riveting testimony to a U.S. House Representatives panel, Slaw said, "Hate starts with speech. The hateful rhetoric you've heard from elected leaders is the direct cause of the horrific shooting at Club Q." The Human Rights Campaign report, "An epidemic of violence documents at least 300 violent deaths of gender nonconforming people killed in the U.S., with 57 in 2021 alone. Since 2013, 85% of the victims were people of color. Sadly, many acts of violence against trans people are not reported or classified as hate crimes." Yeah, anything that comes out of the Human Rights Campaign is propaganda. If you, I know I've talked about it in the podcast before, but if you think for 1 second that the Human Rights Campaign is anything but propaganda, you are highly mistaken. And I encourage you to go look at their website. Just go look at the website and look at it as if you have no sides, okay? And then start to see where they're leaning. They have made their agenda about transness. And so everything being pushed onto us as a society right now is about transness, which is supposed to be such a small populace. They could exist in society as they have without issue, but they're trying to force it onto us as if it is the entire existence of the world, and that's just not true. It's just not true. So we're going to continue her article. "I am disheartened that the term I only intended to improve the precision of the English language may have become a divisive tool in today's toxic landscape of exclusion and violence. But language abhors a vacuum. I do not lay claim to coining the term cisgender as an inventive act as much as an outcome of the inevitable evolution of a living vocabulary. I am convinced the word cisgender was needed, even if the emotion and fear it evokes for some may overshadow its potential to advance understanding. In 2014, 20 years after my fateful inoculation of the word cisgender into the vocabulary, Time magazine released a cover story titled "The Transgender Tipping Point." The article asserted that the transparency of transgender people has been improving the lives of a long misunderstood minority and beginning to yield new policies. The wave of awareness, visibility, and recognition of our contribution to society at every level is monumentous and unprecedented. Okay. I want to believe it cannot be stopped. In recent studies, 9% of high school students in the Pittsburgh area reported gender identities different than those predicted by their sex assigned at birth. And about 5% of young adults say their sex assigned at birth and gender differ. In the study Gender Beyond the Binary, 50% of those 18 to 24-year-olds said gender roles and binary labels are outdated. Young people are the future. And I see one a lot less hung up on gender identity and expression. Okay, Dana. So I'm going to just break down a little bit of what you've written here. So what you're telling me is that a generation of children that was brought up and indoctrinated into an ideology to believe that there are more than just two genders stated that they believed there were more than two genders and that they were non-binary. And then they want to sit here and talk about how gender identity and expression don't matter, except if they don't adhere to a gender binary, then they must be the opposite sex and therefore need to transition, because that's what the ideology states. That is its rhetoric. That is what the belief is. Using cisgender enforces that a child who does not do what normal boys or normal girls do, but does what the opposite sex does, then therefore must be trans. That is what your ideology and your word has created. It created an atmosphere where children can't just be themselves and project themselves in society how they want without having to be one or the other. She says, in my opinion, the number of people identifying as trans or non-binary isn't necessarily growing. They have always been there, it's just that no one asked, and awareness and acceptance have made it possible for kids with gender dysphoria to better understand themselves and achieve self-esteem. As a boomer, I didn't even know trans people existed until decades after experiencing what I later learned was gender dysphoria. Had I seen trans people in daily life, I may have avoided the feeling of fear and isolation that were sometimes so unbearable that I lost the will to live. No matter how hard fanatics try to erase trans people, we will endure, because we have been here throughout history and we are not going anywhere. I'm proud of what trans people have achieved, but I also know we can never drop our guard. Especially at this critical time, like any civil rights movement, constant vigilance is vital. History is full of examples of how quickly society can pivot against the minority group, sometimes with devastating consequences. I would like to think that understanding will change the climate for trans people, but the stamina of racism, Jim Crow, and misogyny makes me realize that the hate has the power to endure. Hold on. This author, Dana DeFoss, keeps referring to herself as trans. We're going to look into that in just a second. But of course, I would like to point out that she couldn't write an article in which she states something to do with racism, which is interesting because there are words used for individuals like Jews, Black peoples, even for gays that do not get used because they've been used as a slur and in a derogatory way. Oh, well, you're just a blank. Just insert here. Cis has been used to harm people so much that it is now one of the words that you can say, insert here, and it will become inherently offensive. It just has. I'm not surprised, though, that of course you would bring up racism in this article. Dana writes, my greatest hope is that people will realize the silence is complicity. The anti-trans movement inordinately targets people of color. The overlap of hate against trans people with anti-Semitism has a long and dark history. The people denying healthcare and bodily autonomy to trans people are the same people denying women those rights. And I call on all communities to voice intolerance and anti-trans hate speech and transparent incitement of violence by those who feign innocence and moral supremacy, because it diminishes all of us. And it's not about words. You don't need to be a student of gender identity terms to know that living in a society means respecting human dignity and autonomy and opposing the victimization of children. Dana DeFoss, PhD, MPH, is a retired researcher and physician educator. She is an author of 2 novels and her poetry appears in numerous journals. She works at a public library where she develops programs and services to empower health literacy in her community. Dana lives with her beloved feline, Anja. Okay. I don't see any imagery of Dana DeFoss here, and that would have been nice. But I'm just going to talk about this closing statements that Dana made here. So, the anti-trans movement is not inordinately targeting people of color. This is propaganda that's being used to make people feel guilty for trans people, to make them feel bad. It is being used, just like the left has always used, this as a way to control you. And as I said in the last episode, they use race to divide us. And they use racism to divide us, which, by the way, if you haven't been keeping up with the news, so the Supreme Court took away affirmative action. And you should see Twitter if you haven't already. There are tweets going off in which people are literally showing their racism. There was a tweet that went extremely viral where a white woman says, without affirmative action, Black people will never have the opportunity to reach into university. And people were really pissed off about it because it's racist to think that Black people can't do anything without affirmative action. We are a merit-based society. Merit matters. It does. And to say that any race isn't capable of getting into a university because of their race is inherently a racist way to think. And what they do with gender ideology is they use race to try to bring people from the Black community over, or people who feel guilty about being other races, i.e. white, and make them feel even more like, oh, I have to be supportive because I have to do this. You don't. Please stop allowing manipulation to occur. It's not about race. Transness is not about race. And when they talk about anti-Semitism, okay, what they're actually trying to do is make projections onto us. Because I have seen more fascist actions come from TRAs than from us at all. What are these bills that she's referenced in this article? All of these bills have to do with a women's rights, a women's bill of rights, and parental rights to protect our children from being indoctrinated, and to protect our children from being transitioned in school without their permission, and from our children being given puberty blockers without us as parents knowing. How are we as parents supposed to take care of our children if they're being medicated and drugged and we're not aware? That is what those bills are there for, to prevent and to protect our children from doing that. That's like if your children went to school every day and I made your child sit down and write down the Bible and study the Bible, and I didn't tell you, or maybe the Quran, or maybe they were going to study Satanism and not tell you, right? You cannot teach children anything without parental consent, period. But it's clear that this is what Dana is, in my opinion, in support of. So I just tried to look it up, and I'm seeing everywhere that she is cisgender, even though in that article, she kept referring to herself as trans or a part of the trans community. And so I'm curious then, in her mind, so if you are in support of trans, then therefore you are already a part of that community. I support the LGBT community, but that does not make me a member of the LGBT community. So I wouldn't say we when I talk about the LGBT community. I would say the community of LGBT. And I think that it's confusing. But then again, I'm not surprised, because people who are practicing gender ideology like to put everybody they can into the same umbrella. I mean, that's what their entire ideology is built off of, an umbrella. So there's all these arguments about cisgender, right? And one thing I didn't say was the actual exact definition of cisgender that Dana came up with. So the official definition of cisgender is denoting or relating to a person whose gender identity corresponds with the sex registered for them at birth, not transgender. Okay? Now, I want you to remember that definition. I'll read it one more time. Denoting or relating to a person whose gender identity corresponds with the sex registered for them at birth, not transgender. Now, we've talked about the 1994 reference, and we've seen what Dana had to say about it. I'm going to take us back a few years to 1991, which would have been during the same time period that Dana miraculously thought to herself, oh, well, duh, cis. When Volkmar Sigues came up with the term cissexual and transsexual. Now, what is cissexual, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. Cissexual is having a gender identity which matches the one's birth sex. For example, identifying male and having been born as a male. That's so interesting to me. Cisgender, denoting or relating to a person whose gender identity corresponds with the sex registered for them at birth. Sexual is having a gender identity which matches one's birth sex. Interesting that in 1994, Dana DeFoss would have this revolutionary term that she had created, yet the exact same definition had been created 3 years prior and published by a professor, a pseudo-sexologist, with the name cissexual instead of cisgender. So, in my mind, cisgender and cissexual are the same thing. They mean the same thing. So when Dana sits here and talks about this revolutionary word that she added to the dictionary, I look at 1991 and I think to myself, I wonder if you saw what Volkmar Sigues actually had published, and maybe it wasn't such an original thought that you had because of science, but perhaps you figured, I'll just swap sexual with gender and that'll work. It's giving, plagiarism. That's what it gives me. Plagiarism. But that's just my own opinion and perspective on what may have occurred back in 1994. So interesting. But let's talk about Volkmar, shall we? This one's going to be fun. So, we have an article that came out January 5th, 2022. Cis was coined by a pedosexual physician. This was written by Genevieve Gluck, and it is on 4w.pub, and I will drop the link below. The term cisgender has gained widespread popularity in recent years, largely due to the push from trans activists who define the word as the opposite of transgender. However, few users of the term are aware it originated with a German sexologist who also believes pedophilia is a sexuality. A 1991 publication by Volkmar Sigues titled Transsexuals and Our Nosomorphic View is credited as the first published instance of the term cisgender as an antonym to transgender. Sigues is a German sexologist, physician, and sociologist who served as the director of the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, the Institute for Sexual Science, at the Clinic of Goethe University, Frankfurt am Main, from 1973 to 2006. Cisgender is now widely used to refer to people who are said to have a gender identity that matches their sex. However, the more accurate translation from Sigues' German coinage is cissexual, though now sex, referring to either sex organs or sexuality, has been replaced by the vague and subjective term gender. The genuinely neological characteristic of transsexualism is that it casts what I have referred to as cissexualism, actually its logical counterpart, in a highly ambiguous light. For if there is trans, a beyond physical gender, there must be a cis, a this side of, as well, Sigues wrote in 1998, referring to his 1991 article. The sexologist's view also includes controversial opinions on pedophilia. Sigues distinguishes between pedophiles who abuse children and pedosexuals who have the same impulses but do not follow through with them. In 2011 interview with Spiegel, Sigues stated that the problem with pedosexuals is not their desire to abuse children, but acting on that impulse. He proposed that the best outcome for treating pedophiles is not the loss of their desire, but instead preventing them from having contact with children. Sigues' claims resemble modern rhetoric around virtuous pedophiles, or MAPS, minor attracted persons, which prioritize the feeling and needs of men who are attracted to children rather than focusing on child safeguarding. Looking at the history of pro-pedophilia policies, the attitudes in Germany during the 60s to 80s, it's clear that Sigues is far from an isolated advocate and that he was simply attempting to popularize ideas that already existed. One key figure behind an open cultural acceptance of pedophilia in Germany was Volkmar Sigues' contemporary, the Berlin-based sexologist Helmut Kentler. Kentler placed foster children in homes of pedophiles beginning in 1969 for the purpose of facilitating child sexual abuse, a project later known as the Kentler Experiment or the Kentler Project. This experiment was authorized and subsidized by the Berlin Senate. In 1988, nearly 2 decades later, Kentler described the project as a complete success in a report he submitted to the Senate. Dr. Joachim Haberlin of the University of Warwick, in his article Feeling Like a Child Dreams and Practices of Sexuality in West German Alternative Left During the Long 1970s, says, In 1970, members of the German parliament charged with reforming criminal law even listened to radical education scholar Helmut Kentler, sexologist Volkmar Sigues, and other sexologists and psychologists who declared that children would not suffer from sexual relations with adults and that those relations should not be punished because they are a crime without a victim. In 1972, Dutch pro-pedophile activist Dr. Fritz Bernard published a paper titled Pedophilia, a Disease? Which concluded that pedophilic contacts do not damage a psychic development of a child, according to Dr. Sonia Levson. In her essay, Pedophile Apologism in the 1970s, Volkmar Sigues was one of the advisory scientists on Bernard's research. According to Dagmar Herzog, author of Sex and After Fascism, Memory and Morality in 20th Century Germany, Volkmar Sigues and his colleague Günther Schmidt, with whom he published research on child sexuality in the 70s, also argued that exposing children to pornography, a well-known grooming tactic of pedophiles, was completely harmless. Volkmar Sigues and Günther Schmidt argued provocatively that the representation of sex per se did not damage to youth or children, and that the kind of pornography in which sex was represented without prejudice as a pleasure-filled social activity, is exactly the kind that one would, without worries, give to children and adolescents, Herzog wrote. In 2010, Sigues published Sexology, the thesis on abuse debate, wherein he lauded the paradise of childhood and claimed that adding taboos to childish eroticism creates what we all want to prevent, sexual violence. There is nothing wrong with pedophilia in the sense of the word, that is, against liking, even loving children, wrote Sigues. The sensuality that spontaneously unfolds between a child and an adult is something wonderful. Nothing can remind us more intensely of the paradises of childhood. Nothing is purer and more harmless than this eroticism of the body and the heart. Childish eroticism is not only full of delights, but it is also necessary. So, let's just talk about what we just listened to, shall we? To sum up where we are at this point in the podcast, Dana DeFoss in 1994 defined cisgender as identifying with and living your life as the gender in which you were quote unquote assigned with at birth, which, by the way, identifying with the gender you were assigned with at birth. This is a cult phrase to say that you are assigned a sex at birth. We know that that is simply not true. No one is assigned at birth. We are witnessed, we are documented, but we are never assigned. You are not assigned a penis. You are not assigned a vagina. You are either born with one or the other, and in some cases you are intersex, and we've been able to handle that for the better part of a millennia now without intersex having to be lumped into transness, because the ideology wants to use that umbrella and pull everyone in so that nobody has the freedom to be anything but what they deem you are. In regards to the 1991 cissexual is to be the gender in which you were born with, right? So essentially, Dana and Volkmar used the same definition, flopped a word from sexual to gender, and Volkmar was a pedophile. He laid the groundwork for MAPS. This man was involved with a horrifying German study. And in that study, they actually placed children into the homes of pedophiles. Okay, so we are going to take a look at The New Yorker. And this is an article that was written July 26, 2021. And it says, the German experiment that placed foster children with pedophiles. With the approval of the government, a renowned sexologist ran a dangerous program. How could this happen? Now remember, we just read an article In regards to Cisgender and Cissexual by Volkmar Sigues, right? And this that we are about to read is in regards to that Kentler experiment that Volkmar was a part of. In 2017, a German man who goes by the name Marco came across an article in a Berlin newspaper with a photograph of a professor he recognized from childhood. The first thing he noticed was the man's lips. They were thin, almost non-existent, a trait that Marco had always found repellent. He was surprised to read that the professor Helmut Kentler had been one of the most influential sexologists in Germany. The article described a new research report that had investigated what was called the Kentler experiment. Beginning in the late 60s, Kentler had placed neglected children in foster homes run by pedophiles. The experiment was authorized and financially supported by the Berlin Senate. In a report submitted to the Senate in 1988, Kentler had described it as a complete success. I'm going to pause real quick because it doesn't surprise me, right? When John Money when he published about the twins and raising David Raymer as Brenda Raymer, he posted it was a complete success, but it wasn't. I mean, the child was struggling, and it would only be a couple of years after that successful publishing, and where even colleagues in the medical field said, I don't think that this is accurate. I think that this is a lie. And people will just take people for their word without doing the actual research. So Kentler has described it as a complete success. Doesn't surprise me. This is what gender ideologists do. They like to say everything's hunky-dory, no problem at all, and can't admit when there is fault, when they are wrong, because they can't. That their ideology doesn't allow them. This is based on narcissism and success. And of course, Kentler wants to be super successful in his ideology to normalize pedophilia, right? Marco had grown up in foster care, and his foster father had frequently taken him to Kentler's home. Now he was 34 with a 1-year-old daughter, and her meals and naps structured his day. After he read the article, he said, I just pushed it aside. I didn't react emotionally. I did what I do every day. Nothing, really. I sat down and I sat around in front of the computer. Marco looks like a movie star. He's tanned with a firm jaw, thick dark hair, and a long symmetrical face. As an adult, he has cried only once. If someone were to die in front of me, I would of course want to help them, but it wouldn't affect me emotionally, he told me. I have a wall, and emotions just hit against it. He lived with his girlfriend, a hairdresser, but they never discussed his childhood. He was unemployed. Once he tried to work as a mailman, but after a few days he quit because whenever a stranger made an expression that reminded him of his foster father, an engineer named Fritz Hinkel, he had the sensation that he was not actually alive, that his heart had stopped beating, and that the color had drained from the world. When he tried to speak, it felt as if his voice didn't belong to him. Several months after reading the article, Marco looked up the number for Tessa Nentwig, a young political scientist at the University of Göttingen Institute for Democracy Research, who had written the report on Kentler. He felt both curious and ashamed. When she answered the phone, he identified himself as an affected person. He told her that his foster father had spoken with Kentler on the phone every week. In ways that Marco had never understood, Kentler, a psychologist and a professor of social education at the University of Hanover, had seemed deeply invested in his upbringing. Nentwig had assumed that Kentler's experiment ended in the 1970s, but Marco told her that he lived with his foster home until 2003, when he was 21. I was totally shocked, she said. She remembers Marco saying several times, "You are the first person I have told. This is the first time I have told my story." As a child, he'd taken it for granted that the way he was treated was normal. Such things happen, he told himself. The world is like this. It's eat and be eaten. But now, he said, I realized the state has been watching. A few weeks later, Marco phoned one of his foster brothers, whom he calls Sven. They had lived together in Hinkel's home for 13 years. He liked Sven, but felt little connection to him. They had never really had a real conversation. He told Sven he'd learned that they had been a part of an experiment, but Sven seemed unable to process the information. After all of those years, we had gotten out of the habit of thinking, Marco said. As a young boy, Marco liked to pretend he was one of the Templars, an order of the knights that protected pilgrims to the Holy Land. He was a lively child who occasionally wandered around his Berlin neighborhood unsupervised. At 5 in 1988, he crossed the street alone and was hit by a car. He was not seriously injured, but the accident attracted the attention of Schönberg Youth Welfare Office, which is run by the Berlin state government. Caseworkers at the office observed that Marco's mother seemed unable to give him the necessary emotional attention. She worked at the sausage stand and was struggling to manage parenthood on her own. Marco's father, a Palestinian refugee, had divorced her. She sent Marco and his older brother to daycare in dirty clothes and left them there for 11 hours. Caseworkers recommended that Marco be placed in a foster home with a family-like atmosphere. One described him as an attractive boy who was wild but very easy to influence. Marco was assigned to live with Hinkle, a 47-year-old single man who supplemented his income as a foster father by repairing jukeboxes and other electronics. Marco was Hinkle's 8th foster son in 16 years. When Hinkle began fostering children in 1973, a teacher noticed that he was always looking for contact with boys. 6 years later, a caseworker observed that Hinkle appeared to be in a homosexual relationship with one of his foster sons. When a public prosecutor launched an investigation, Helmut Kentler, who called himself Hinkle's permanent advisor, intervened on Hinkle's behalf, a pattern that repeats throughout more than 800 pages of case files about Hinkle's home. Kentler was a well-known scholar, the author of several books on sex education and parenting, and he was often quoted in Germany's leading newspapers and on its TV programs. The newspaper Die Zeit had described him as the nation's chief authority on questions of sexual education. On university letterhead, Kentler issued what he called an expert opinion, explaining that he had come to know Hinkle through a research project, and he commended Hinkle on his parenting skills and disparaged a psychologist who invaded the privacy of his home, making wild interpretations. Sometimes Kentler wrote an airplane is not a phallic symbol. It is simply a plane. The criminal investigation was suspended. I'm going to pause and just give you my thoughts real quick. The gaslighting that Hinkle, and using his authority as this, professor and this well-renowned German sexologist, he gaslit a fellow psychologist who was saying something's not right because he wanted his project, his pedophilic project, to continue. Oh my God, that's so disturbing. Marco was impressed by Hinkle's apartment. It had 5 bedrooms and was on the 3rd floor of an old building on one of the main shopping streets in Friedenau, a upscale neighborhood popular among politicians and writers. 2 other foster sons lived there, and a 16-year-old and a 24-year-old, neither of whom was particularly friendly to Marco, but he was delighted to discover an armoire in the hallway that held a cage with 2 rabbits that he could play with and feed. In a report to the Youth Welfare Office, Hinkle noted that Marco was excited about almost everything that was offered to him. Every few months, Hinkle drove nearly 200 miles with his foster children to see Kentler in Hanover, where he taught. The visits were an opportunity for Kentler to observe the children, to hear what they say about their past, their dreams, and their fears, to know their wishes and hopes, to see how they develop and how they feel, Hinkle wrote. In a photograph taken during one of their visits, Kentler wears a white button-up shirt with a pen in the pocket, and Marco sits at the dining room table beside him, looking bored and dazed. Marco had been living with Hinkle for a year and a half when Sven moved in. The police had found him in a subway station in Berlin, sick with hepatitis. He was 7 years old, begging for money, and he said that he had come from Romania. Noting that Sven had likely never experienced a positive parent-child relationship, the Youth Welfare Office searched for a foster home in Berlin. Mr. Hinkle seems to be ideally suited to this difficult task, doctors from a clinic at the Free University of Berlin wrote. Sorry, I got caught up on some random ad in the middle of the article. Okay. These 2 boys took on different roles in their new family. Sven was a good son, docile and loving. Marco was more defiant, but at night when Hinkle came into his room asking to cuddle or waited for him while he brushed his teeth before bed, he had to comply. I just accepted it out of the loyalty because I didn't know anything else, Marco told me. I didn't think what was happening was good, but I thought it was normal. I thought of it a little bit like food. People have different tastes in food the same way people have different tastes in sexuality. If Sven's bedroom door was open and he wasn't there, Marco knew what was happening. But the two boys never talked about what Hinkle did to them. It was an absolutely taboo subject, Marco said. One night, Marco took a knife from the kitchen and slept with it under his pillow. When Hinkle approached his bed and discovered the blade, he withdrew quickly. Called Helmut Kentler, then handed the phone to Marco. There's a devil behind my wall, Marco tried to explain. Kentler had a calming, grandfatherly presence. He assured Marco that there was no such thing as devils, and Marco agreed to surrender the knife. Marco's mother and brother were allowed to visit roughly once a month, but Hinkle often canceled the visits at last minute or cut them short, saying that they were disruptive. Afterward, Marco would sometimes urinate in his bed and lose focus in school, writing numbers and letters backwards. It was as if he wanted to say, there is no point in anything, Hinkle wrote. Kentler warned the Youth Welfare Office that Marco's educational successes are ruined by a few hours of being with his mother. Marco's father was not allowed to see him at all because Hinkle reported that Marco said that his dad had beaten him. Marco was so terrified of his father, Hinkle said, that he suffered from fearful fantasies when he noticed people of Arab appearance on the street. The lies that this man made up to keep this child isolated. Marco's teacher recommended that he see a child therapist who was supposed to meet with him for 2 hours a week, but the therapist said that Hinkle was holding Marco prisoner. Hinkle also always sat close by in an adjacent room. Marcos remembers that once after a session began without Hinkle's realizing it, he barged into the room and hit the therapist in the face. When a school psychologist referred Sven for counseling too, Hinkle would not allow him to take any psychological tests according to records. Not with me, he shouted. If you all want to make a case out of Sven, then do it without me. Sven seemed upset by the outburst, asking Hinkle, does that mean you want to give me away? In a letter, Kentler advised the Youth Welfare Office that if a psychological assessment had to be done, he would perform it. Insights beyond my findings are not to be expected, he wrote. He acknowledged that Hinkle could appear harsh and hurtful, but I ask you to consider that a man who deals with such seriously damaged children is not a simple person, he wrote in another letter. What Mr. Hinkle needs from the authorities is trust and protection. This man, this sexologist, is protecting a pedophile and harming children for the benefit of his study of pedophilia. He had to know that these children were being harmed, psychologically and physically harmed by this man. And he allowed it. Kentler allowed this to happen for the sanctity of his program. It is disturbing to me that this is the mindset that has literally added and embedded itself into gender ideology. And that's why we don't see people so much as getting in trouble for forcing their rhetoric onto other people. Because they gaslight everyone. When Marco was 9, his mother petitioned a district judge in Berlin to allow her to spend more time with him. Marco's father told the Youth Welfare Office that he could not understand why Marco was growing up in a strange family, deprived of an Arabic education. He also made massive accusations against the foster father's behavior, a caseworker wrote. But Marco's mother had signed an agreement stating that she would always be guided by the best interests of my child, and that determination was made by the Youth Welfare Office. A hearing was held in March 1992, a month before Marco turned 10. The judge asked to speak privately with Marco, but Hinkle stood directly outside the room and said, "If you are being threatened, call out." Marco sounded as if he had been coached. He told the judge that his foster father, whom he called Papa, loved him and his birth family did not. When the judge asked if he still wanted his mother to visit, he responded, "Not often." He said that once a year would be better and that insisted that Papa should be there. He explained that he was afraid of his biological father, and now that he was with Papa, he was no longer scared. Only sometimes at night, he added. After the hearing, Kentler sent a letter to the judge saying, for the best interests of the child, I consider it absolutely essential that contact with the family of origin, including the mother, to be completely suspended for the next 2 years. Kentler also emphasized that Marco needed distance from the men in his family because they set a bad example. He said that Marco's mood changed when he spoke to his father, or about his father, excuse me. Though Kentler had never met Marco's dad, he characterized him as authoritarian, abusive, and macho. He also disapproved of Marco's 15-year-old brother, who was 6'4" and weighed 225 pounds. The boy gives the false impression of strength and superiority, Kentler wrote, and was already molding himself in the father's image. He was addicted to being the big man. Oh my God. I can't believe these courts just allowed this foster father to alienate these children from their families so drastically. But they would never have been able to do it had Kentler not been there poking and prodding and making sure to keep those boys in that household. How evil of a man Kentler was to be backing this and letting it continue to happen. Mind you, this court dates in what? 1992, it was saying, I believe. I'm going to scroll up a couple paragraphs. March 1992. So this is like a year after Volkmar Sigues came out with Cissexual, and he came out with transsexual, right? This man was a part of this whole study. Although the New Yorker isn't talking about Volkmar Sigues in it, at least we haven't seen that happen yet. I think it's very important to note. Okay, so before we keep going, just so you guys know, this is a long article that we're reading here, and I will read through all of it. So if you're enjoying listening and you haven't already, make sure you smack that like button. If you're not subscribed, subscribe. I like breaking down these articles with you guys and giving you context. So Volkmar Sigues worked on this study with Kentler, and this was the type of man that essentially Volkmar was a protege of. So Volkmar, who normalized maps, was molded by the man who allowed these children to remain in the home of a pedophile. And Volkmar coined the definition of cissexual in the same way that Dana DeFoss defined cisgender. And if that doesn't make your skin crawl, then hopefully finishing this New Yorker article will actually validate those feelings of disgust and disdain. Kentler's career was framed by his belief in the damage wrought by dominant fathers. An early memory was of walking in the forest on a spring day and running to keep up with his father. I had only one wish, that he should take my hand and hold it in his, Kentler wrote in a parenting magazine in 1983. But his father, a lieutenant of the First World War, believed in a rod and baton pedagogy. As Kentler put it, Kentler's parents followed the teachings of Daniel Gottlieb Moritz Schreber, a best-selling German authority on childcare, who has been described as a spiritual precursor of Nazism. Oh no. Schreber outlined principles of child rearing that would create a stronger race of men, ridding them of cowardice, laziness, and unwanted displays of vulnerability and desire. Suppress everything in the child, Schreber wrote in 1858. Emotions must be suffocated in their seed right away. When Kentler misbehaved, his father threatened to buy a contraption invented by Schreber to promote children's posture and compliance. Shoulder bands to prevent slouching, a belt that held their chest in place while they slept, an iron bar pressed to their collarbone so they'd sit up straight at the table. If Kentler talked out of turn, his father slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "When the father talks, the children must be silent." Kentler was 10 during the Kristallnacht in 1938, when Nazi stormtroopers raided Jewish temples, stores, and houses. Kentler's family was living in Dusseldorf, and Kentler was awakened by the noise of shattering glass. He came out of his bedroom and saw his father in a nightdress holding the phone. In his loud, dominant voice, my father called for a police deployment because someone had broken into our building. Kentler wrote in Borrowed Fathers, Children Need Fathers, a 1989 book about parenthood. It was a longer conversation during which my father became ever quieter, and ultimately he timidly hung up the receiver, stood there like he had collapsed, and quietly said to my mother, who had been standing next to him for some time, "They're going after the Jews." Soon the doorbell rang. A Jewish family, a mother, father, and 3 children who lived in the apartment below, stood at the door. Their apartment had been destroyed, and they asked if they could spend the night with the Kentlers. "No, that will really not be possible here," Kentler's father said. He shut the door. Kentler glimpsed his father's nightshirt climbing just above his knee, revealing a soft, naked legs. "My whole father suddenly seemed laughable to me," he wrote. First of all, why would he have described his father's legs in that way? That's weird to me, that he would recall his father's naked body in that way. That's honestly a clear sign of how he viewed men with children in the first place. Like, that's sexualizing it. That made me just as uncomfortable as it made me for his father turning away that Jewish family. Shortly afterward, Kentler's father was called back to active duty. He rose to the rank of colonel and moved his family to Berlin, where he worked at the high command of the army of Nazi Germany. My father's authority was never based on his own accomplishment, but on the large institutions in which he snuck into that rubbed off on him, Kentler wrote. He was 17 when the Nazis were defeated and his father came home. "A broken man," Kentler wrote. "I never again obeyed him, and I felt terribly alone." The post-war years in West Germany were marked by an intense preoccupation with sexual propriety, as if decorum could solve the nation's moral crisis and cleanse it of guilt. One's own offspring did penance for Auschwitz, the German poet Olav Munzberg wrote. With ethics and morality forcefully jammed into them, women's reproductive rights were severely restricted, and the policing of homosexual encounters, a hallmark of Nazism, persisted. In the 2 decades after the war, roughly 100,000 men were prosecuted for this crime. Kentler was attracted to men and felt as if he always had one leg in prison because of the risks involved in consummating his desires. He found solace in the book Corydon by André Gide, a series of Socratic dialogues about the naturalness of queer love. This book took away my fear of being a failure and of being rejected and of being in the negative biological variant, he wrote in a 1985 essay, Our Homosexuality. But nothing could be done to remedy his relationship with his parents. "They no longer loved me," he wrote. In 1960, Kentler got a degree in psychology, a field that allowed him to be an engineer in the realm of manipulable soul, he said at a lecture. He became involved in the student movement, and at the meeting of the Republican Club, a group established for left-wing intellectuals, he publicly identified himself as gay for the first time. Not long afterward, he wrote, "He decided to turn my passions into a profession, which is also good for the passions. They are controlled." He earned a doctorate in social education from the University of Hanover, publishing his dissertation, a guidebook called Parents Learn Sex Education, in 1975. He was inspired by the Marxist psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich, who had argued that the free flow of sexual energy was essential to building a new kind of society. Kentler's dissertation urged parents to teach their children that they should never be ashamed of their desires. Once the first feelings of shame exist, they multiply easily and expand into all areas of life, he wrote. You mean like when children don't stick to binary norms and so they must be the opposite gender and feel shame in their biological sex for being anything quote unquote abnormal? Just food for thought. Like many of his contemporaries, Kentler came to believe that sexual repression was key to understanding the fascist consciousness. In 1977, the sociologist Klaus Thaulight published Male Fantasies, a 2-volume book that drew on the diaries of German paramilitary fighters and concluded that their inhibited drives, along with the fear of anything gooey, gushing, or smelly, had been channeled into a new outlet: destruction. When Kentler read Male Fantasies, he could see Schreber, the child care author whose principles his parents had followed, at work everywhere, he wrote. Kentler argued the ideas like Schreber's had been so widely read that one book went through 40 editions, had poisoned 3 generations of Germans, creating authoritarian personalities who have to identify with a great man around them to feel great themselves. Kentler's goal was to develop a child-rearing philosophy for a new kind of German man. Sexual liberation, he wrote, was the best way to prevent another Auschwitz. The trials of 22 former Auschwitz officers had revealed a common personality type: ordinary, conservative, sexually inhibited, and preoccupied with bourgeoisie morality. I do think that in a society that was more free about sexuality, Auschwitz could not have happened, the German legal scholar Herbert Jäger said. Sexual emancipation was integral to student movements throughout Western Europe, but the pleas were more pitched in Germany, where the memory of genocide had become inextricably, if not entirely, accurately, linked with sexual primeness. In Sex After Fascism, the historian Dagmar Herzog describes how in Germany conflicts over sexual mores became an important site for managing the memory of Nazism. But she adds it was also a way to redirect moral debate away from the problem of complicity in mass murder and toward a narrowed conception of morality as solely concerned with sex. Suddenly, it seemed as if all relationship structures could and must be reconfigured. If there was any hope of producing a generation less damaged than the previous one, in the late 60s, educators in more than 30 German cities and towns began establishing experimental daycare centers where children were encouraged to be naked and to explore one another's bodies. There is no question that they were trying, in a desperate sort of neo-Rousseauian, authoritarian, anti-authoritarianism, to remake German and human nature, Herzog writes. Kentler inserted himself into a movement that was urgently working to undo the sexual legacy of fascism, but struggling to differentiate among various taboos. I'm going to pause for a second. This part about children were being encouraged to be naked and explore one another's bodies seems very familiar to me in regards to the children's books that are being pushed into classrooms and libraries and schools around the world, and especially in the United States, that is trying to normalize imagery of masturbation and discussion of sex and descriptive how sex works and feels for minors. But that's just my opinion. In 1976, the magazine Das Blatt argued that forbidden sexual desire, such as that for children, was the revolutionary event that turns our everyday life on its head, that lets feelings break out, and that shatters the basis of our thinking. A few years later, Germany's newly established Green Party, which brought together anti-war protesters, environmental activists, and veterans of the student movement, tried to address the oppression of children's sexuality. Members of the party advocating abolishing the age of consent for sex between children and adults. Sounds very familiar. If you guys haven't been paying attention to the lowering of age of consent for medical purposes and sexual purposes that's been going on, this was back in the 70s, and here we are in the 2020s, and this is a repeat of what happened in Germany. It's just under gender ideology instead of sexual revolution. In this climate, a psychoanalyst described it as one of denial and manic self-reparation. Kentler was a star. He was asked to lead the Department of Social Education at the Pedagogical Center, an international research institute in Berlin whose planning committee included Willy Brandt, who became the Chancellor of Germany and won a Nobel Peace Prize, and James B. Conant, the first U.S. ambassador to West Germany and president of Harvard. Funded and supervised by the Berlin Senate, the center was established in 1965 to make Berlin an international leader in reforming educational practices. Kentler worked on a problem of runaway heroin addicts and young prostitutes, many of whom gathered in the archways of the Zoo Station, the main transportation hub in West Berlin. The Milieu was memorialized in Christian F., an iconic drug movie of the 80s about teenagers prematurely aware of the emptiness of modern society, self-destructing, set to a soundtrack by David Bowie. I need to pause because I just had something click for me. This article just made something click for me. So in this article, we're reading that all of these German psychoanalysts and Kentler himself and all of them believe that the sexual revolution to separate themselves from fascism, they needed to go to an extreme place in regards to sex and normalize that in their children, right? And when I look at gender ideology, I'm just seeing this as another wave of that ideology, which is all rooted in fascism. But it doesn't surprise me, right? Because women are silenced for speaking, men are silenced for speaking, gays and bisexuals and lesbians are silenced for speaking. We're not allowed to speak a certain word. We're not allowed to think a certain way. They want to be thought police over what we believe. They try to change the way that we perceive history. They've even, as we saw in the last episode, they redid a photo from a 1983 strike where gays were striking because of a death of a gay man, a murder of a gay man. And Dublin had placed the trans rights or human rights over the sign about police are not on your side, on our side, right? If the sexual revolution in Germany was a way to offset fascism, and today, gender ideology is trying to normalize sexualization, hypersexualization of children. To me, fascism, the sexual revolution, and gender ideology are all connected. My mind has just been blown. And I'm visualizing all of these little like red lines just connecting to dots now. What an epiphany. What a reading rainbow moment for me. We're going to definitely be digging deeper into this as we go, but let's continue, shall we? Kentler befriended a 13-year-old named Ulrich, whom he described as one of the most sought-after prostitutes in the station scene. When Kentler asked Ulrich where he wanted to stay at night, Ulrich told him about a man he called Mother Winter, who fed boys from the zoo station and did their laundry. In exchange, they slept with him. I said to myself, if the prostitutes call this man Mother, he can't be bad, Kentler wrote. Later, he noted that Ulrich's advantage was that he was handsome and that he enjoyed sex, so he could give something back to pedophile men who looked after him. See, that disturbs me. These men, we're using the term mother. Why? Because mothers are supposed to be comforting and a safe space for children to be. And so obviously saying, call me mother, think of me as a loving person that can be there for you. Hello? No, thank you. That here is an early instance of when men tried to take something away from women. Mother. Kentler formalized Ulrich's arrangement. I managed to get to the Senate officer responsible to approve it. He wrote in Borrowed Fathers, Children Need Fathers. Kentler found several pedophiles who lived nearby, and he helped them set up foster homes too. At the time, the Berlin Senate, which governs the city, one of the 16 states in the country, was eager to find new solutions to the life problems of our society in order to confirm and maintain Berlin's reputation as an outpost of freedom and humanity, Kentler wrote. In 1981, Kentler was invited to the German parliament to speak about why homosexuality should be decriminalized. It didn't happen for 13 more years, but he strayed unprompted into a discussion of his experiment. We looked after and advised these relationships very intensively, he said. He held consultations with the foster fathers and their sons, many of whom had been so neglected that they had never learned to read or write. These people only put up with these feeble-minded boys because they were in love with them, he told the lawmakers. His summary did not seem to provoke concerns. Perhaps the politicians were receptive because the project seemed to be the opposite of the Nazis' reproductive experiments, with their rigid emphasis on propagating certain kinds of families. Or perhaps they were unconcerned because, in their opinion, the boys were already lost. In the 60s and 70s, the political elite were suddenly taking an interest in the lower class, but their capacity for identification was apparently limited. If there were ever files in the city's archives documenting how Kentler's project came to be approved or how exactly he located the men who served as foster fathers, they have been lost or destroyed. When Kentler publicly discussed his experiment, he offered details about only 3 foster homes. But in a 2020 report commissioned by the Berlin Senate, scholars at the University of Hildesheim concluded that the Senate also ran foster homes or shared flats for young Berliners with pedophile men in the other parts of West Germany. The 58-page report was preliminary and vague. The authors said there were about 1,000 unsorted files in the basement of a government building that they had been unable to read. No names were revealed, but the authors wrote that these foster homes were run by sometimes powerful men who lived alone and who were given the power by academia, research institutions, and other pedagogical environments that accepted, supported, or even lived out pedophile stances. The report concluded that some Senate actors had been part of this network, while others had merely tolerated the foster homes because icons of educational reform policies supported such arrangements. So yet we have another example here of pedophilia being excused because of the individuals in seats of power. Brava. Brava. Marco remembers Kentler and his foster father talking for hours on the phone about politics. The intensity of their conversations surprised him because Hinkle was laconic at home, rarely speaking in full sentences. Marco and Sven didn't talk to each other either. Marco spent all of his free time in his room and on an Amiga computer, playing SimCity and Megalomania. Both boys kept their doors closed. Once when the neighbors played loud music, breaking the silence in their apartment, Hinkle told the boys that he wanted to drill holes in the 2 microwave ovens and then aim the radioactive waves toward each other at just the right angle to give the neighbors a heart attack. I didn't know that was possible. I had no idea that was even possible. Marco's mother lost her plea for more access to her son. She was still allowed visits every few weeks at the youth welfare office, but the meetings went increasingly badly. During the first visit, after the court hearing, Marco told his mother that he didn't want to see her because she didn't get along with his foster father. While he was saying this, he did not make eye contact with his mother. A social worker wrote, at the next visit 3 weeks later, he refused to accept his mother's gift, pens and a pad of paper, or to answer her questions. He repeatedly asked to leave until his mother reluctantly agreed. She was visibly shaken and cried, the social worker wrote. She no longer knows what to do. The next day, Hinkle called the youth welfare office and said that he would support Marco in demonstrating his rejection of his mother. A year and a half later, Marco's father informed the youth welfare office that he was moving to Syria and wanted to say goodbye to his son. There is no record of anyone responding. Marco's opinion of his parents became overlaid with the insults he'd heard from Hinkle and Kentler. He imagined his mother as a lazy woman who spent her days eating sausages, his father as a violent patriarch. It wasn't until 2 decades later that he grasped that his parents had fought to have a relationship with him. Some nights when Marco was eating dinner with Sven and Hinkle, he would have the sensation that he was among strangers. "Who are you people?" he asked once. Hinkle responded, "It's me, your father." When Marco was 11 years old, a new foster son, Marcel Kramer, moved in. Kramer was a small boy with dimples, crooked teeth, and a sweet, open smile. He was half a year younger than Marco and had spastic quadriplegia, a congenital condition that left him unable to walk, talk, or eat on his own. Marco and Sven became Kramer's caretakers, feeding him strawberry-flavored milk with a spoon and removing mucus from his lungs with a suction hose. When they went to Hinkle's house in Brandenburg, west of Berlin, Marco pushed Kramer for hours on a tire swing. Kramer was the first person in years for whom Marco had felt love. At school, Marco had no close relationships. Hinkle encouraged him to misbehave, rewarding him with computer games if he spat, talked out of turn, or overturned chairs. He skipped class and he rarely did his homework. He ended up switching schools 7 times, which now he believes was Hinkle's plan. For years, Marco tolerated Hinkle, but as he began going through puberty, he said, "I started to hate him." He spent an hour each day lifting weights so that he would be strong enough to defend himself, and one night, when Hinkle tried to fondle him, Marco hit his hand. Hinkle seemed startled, but didn't say anything. He just walked away. Hinkle stopped trying to sexually molest Marco, but he became punitive. At night, he locked the door to the kitchen so that Marco couldn't eat. His greed when eating was noticeable, Hinkle once wrote. He also hit Marco. "Go on, let off some steam," Marco sometimes said, taunting Hinkle. He said he wasn't hitting me. He was hitting the devil inside of me, Marco told me. When Marco turned 18, he was legally free to leave Hinkle's home, but it didn't occur to him to move out. It's very hard to describe, but I was never raised to think critically about anything, he said. I had an empty mind. One day, Kramer developed the flu. In the course of 48 hours, his breathing became increasingly labored. For years, Marco had checked on Kramer several times a night to make sure that he was breathing. Now he was so worried that he lay in bed beside him. Hinkle had always resisted calling doctors for the boys, but by the time he gave in, Kramer could not be resuscitated. It happened in front of my eyes, Marco said. I was looking into his eyes when he died. That's extremely sad. The foster care files contain only a brief note documenting Kramer's death. Call from Mr. Hinkle, who says that Marcel died unexpectedly last night. An employee at the Youth Welfare Office wrote in September 2001, previously there were no signs of an infection. A subsequent note says that Hinkle, who was 60, was looking to take in another child. After Teresa Nentwig's I keep mispronouncing this reporter's name. Teresa's report on Kentler in 2016, she planned to write her habilitation thesis, a requirement for a career in academia, on Kentler's life and work. But there were many setbacks. Relevant files in city archives of Berlin were missing, unsorted, and sealed. Friends and colleagues of Kentler who had died in 2008 told Nentwig that they didn't want to talk. Some said that Kentler is a very good man and he has only done things which are good, Nentwig told me. Nentwig gives the impression of being a methodical and undramatic scholar, the type who never misses a deadline. In the summer of 2020, when we first spoke, she told me, I have no future in the university because it is very hard to have success with this sort of subject. I am criticizing the academic world. I assumed that, as ambitious people tend to do, she was motivating herself with a fear of worst-case scenarios. But the next time I spoke with her this spring, she had taken a job with a regional state office for the protection of the Constitution, a German intelligence agency that monitors anti-democratic threats. Her university contract had not been renewed, and she blamed the premature end of her academic career in part on her decision to research Kentler. I am a political scientist, she said, and people were always asking, what is political about this topic? Nentwig and her former university are now splitting the cost, some 6,000 euros, for a German academic press to publish what would have been her thesis. In the book, which comes out in September, she reveals that Kentler, the single father and of 3 adopted sons and several foster children, appeared to be conducting his own informal version of the experiment that the Berlin Senate had authorized. Karen Desertat, the co-author of the book called Sex, Lust, and Life, told Nentwig that 2 of Kentler's foster sons had come to her for therapy and divulged that Kentler had sexually abused them. Desertat owed a lot to Kentler, she said. He had helped her get out of her first teaching position, or helped her to get her first teaching position, and she did not want to get involved. She referred to the boys to another therapist. The boys preferred to keep their abuse private, she said, because they didn't want to lose the positives of Kentler's care, that they had enough to eat and that they were taken care of and things like that. Kentler's experiment seemed to rest on the idea that some children are fundamentally second class, their outlook so compromised that any kind of love is a gift, a proposition, and that his colleagues apparently accepted too. Desertat said that she eventually broke off contact with Kentler, concluding that his behavior had been creepy. Gunther Schmidt, a former president of the International Academy of Sex Research, which attracts the field's leading researchers, was friends with Kentler for more than 20 years. I honestly had respect for it, he told Nentwig of the experiment, because I thought, these are really young people who are in the worst situation. They probably have a long history at home, they had miserable childhoods, and someone is looking after them. And if Kentler is there, it'll be fine, he added. And the Berlin Senate is also there. When Kentler was 57, he wrote Schmidt a letter explaining why he was aging happily, rather than becoming lonely and resigned. He and his 26-year-old son were a part of a very fulfilling love story that had lasted 13 years and still felt fresh. Hold on. Let's do the math here. His foster son is 26. But he's been in a 13-year fulfilling love story. So 26 minus 10, that's 16 minus 3, 13-year-old boy. Kentler was in a relationship, a sexually fulfilling relationship for 13 years with a 13-year-old. A 13-year-old child. I am so, I expected this. I expected this to happen because I knew that I've already done the groundwork of the research. I hadn't gotten into the depths of this article before. And this is the man that Volkmar Sigues worked with for that study. This is the man that he associated with. You are who you associate with, just an FYI. If you surround yourself with a man who has an experiment by putting children in foster care with pedophiles and is himself a pedophile, and you condone that, and you say, well, they're not pedophiles. They have paraphilias, which, by the way, there's other evidence of things Volkmar Sigues has said, but I digress. This is the rabbit hole we're down tonight. We're very far into the article. We're going to finish learning about Kentler, the man who led the experiment that Volkmar worked on. To understand his state of mind, Kentler wrote his friend should know his secret. So, for much of his career, Kentler spoke of pedophiles as benefactors. They offered neglected children a possibility of therapy, he told Dr. Der Spiegel in 1980. There's no doctor there. It's Der Spiegel. When the Berlin Senate commissioned him to prepare an expert report on the subject of homosexuals as caregivers and educators in 1988, he explained that there was no need to worry that children would be harmed by sexual contact with caretakers as long as the interaction was not forced. The consequences can be very positive, especially when the sexual relationship can be characterized as mutual love, he wrote. I'm sorry. That's just grooming. That is just grooming children. That is exactly what that is. You can't force someone who's groomed because their reality has been warped into believing that something abnormal is normal. That is what grooming does. All of this experiment did was, it was a large, wide scale of how to groom children and what's the best way to do it. That's what this experiment was. But in 1991, he seemed to rethink his opinion after his youngest adopted son, the one he praised in the letter to Schmidt, committed suicide. Then he read the paper Confusion of the Tongues Between Adults and a Child, the language of tenderness and of passion, by Sander Ferenczi, a Hungarian psychoanalyst and a student of Freud. The paper describes how sexualized relationships between adults and children are always asymmetrical, exploitative, and destructive. Thank you, Sandor. Thank you. Ferenczi warns that to give children more love, or love of a different kind, than they seek will have just as pathogenic consequences as denying them love. Children's personalities are not sufficiently consolidated in order to be able to protest, he writes. They will subordinate themselves like automata. They become oblivious of their own needs and identify themselves with the aggressor. In an interview with German historian in 1992, Kentler spoke of his grief for his adopted son and said, "Unfortunately, I only read the Ferenczi essay after his death. He did not confess to abusing his son. Instead, he said that the boy had been sexually abused by his birth mother. He hung himself because of that." He told the historian, "I've experienced it in the biggest way, in a very close way, and certainly I'm partly to blame." He regretted that until the Ferenczi paper, he had not read anything about the emotional aftermath of sexual abuse and did not know how to help his son process the trauma. He didn't understand that a child recovering from sexual abuse feels split, as Ferenczi describes it. He is innocent and culpable at the same time, and his confidence in the testimony of his own senses is broken. "I was stupid," Kentler said. Okay, hold on. Once again, here's Kentler lying about what happened, lying about the truth, and trying to turn the narrative to make himself the victim. That's exactly what gender ideology does. They lie and they manipulate and they groom children and indoctrinate them into an ideology that is not sound. It's just not sound. By the late 90s, Kentler had stopped seeing Henkel's foster sons or involving himself in their upbringing. In what was likely his last recorded public statement about pedophilia in an interview in 1999, he referred to it as a sexual disorder and alluded to the impossibility of an adult and child sharing an understanding of sexual contact. The problem, he said, is that the adult will always have the monopoly on definition. When I first began corresponding with Marco in the summer of 2020, our communication was mediated by a man named Christoph Schwer, who referred to himself as Marco's friend. Initially, I assumed that he was Marco's lawyer. Then I looked him up online and saw he had received a PhD in philosophy, publishing a dissertation called Homesickness, Heroes, Cheerfulness, Nietzsche's Path to Becoming a Superhero. He worked for the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, Germany's right-wing party, as an advisor for education and cultural policy. The party was recently investigated by Germany's Domestic Intelligence Agency for undermining democracy by, among other things, minimizing the crimes of the Nazis. The party's co-leader has called the Nazi era just a speck of bird poop in more than 1,000 years of successful German history. Last August, Marco Schwer and Thomas Rogers, a Berlin journalist, who also works as a translator, met at a hotel attached to Berlin's international airport. The only place we could come up with that would be sufficiently private. I spoke with them via Zoom. Marco and Schwer sat in chairs beside the bed, and they did not appear to have a particularly familiar rapport. Marco wore a flowery button-up Hawaiian shirt and had not shaved in a few days. Schwer, dressed for the office, had a prim business-like manner, like an agent helping a celebrity client. He seemed a bit bored by our conversation, but occasionally chimed in, prompting Marco to share more memorable details. When you first saw him, you thought, what a crooked mouth he has, Schwer offered, referring to Henkel. He had no lips, Marco clarified. He explained that Kentler, too, had this trait. Schwer demonstrated by pressing his mouth together so that only a sliver of the bottom and upper lip were visible. Do you know people who have no lips, Marco said. They are always egotistical and mean. I noticed that. Schwer first contacted Marco in early 2018 after reading the article in Der Spiegel about Kentler's experiment, in which Marco said that he'd been let down by the Berlin Senate. After the publication of Netwig's report, Marco wrote to the Senate asking for more information about what had happened to him, but he felt that the Senate was insufficiently responsive. Schwer had offered to help from the AfD. Marco told me, I immediately said not for political purposes, only because I want help. From the perspective of an AfD politician, Marco's life story was expedient, a tale about the ways in which the German left had got sexual politics wrong. At meetings of the German parliament, members of the AfD, which won more than 12% of the vote in the last national election, becoming Germany's third largest party, rallied around the Kentler's case as a way of forcing left-wing politicians to address history that did not reflect well on their parties, but also as a barely disguised vehicle for impugning homosexuality. An advocacy group affiliated with the AfD held Stop Kentler's Sex Education rallies to protest the way that sexuality is currently taught in German schools. Kentler's criminal pedophile spirit lives on unbroken in today's sex education, a brochure printed by the organization explained. History seemed to be looping back on itself. Right-wing politicians were calling for a return to the kind of terribly dangerous upbringing against which Kentler had rebelled. In its party manifesto, the AfD states that it has committed to the traditional family as a guiding principle, an idea that it associates with the maintenance of Germany's cultural identity and power. To counteract the influx of immigrants to Germany, the only mid- and long-term solution, the AfD program says, is to attain a higher birth rate by the native population. At a hearing in February 2018, an AfD representative, Thorsten Wib, I don't know what letter that is in German. It's a weird squiggly B, everyone. Complained that the Senate had not taken responsibility for Kentler's crimes. This is a case of political importance, which also requires political action, he said. The Senate is double-crossing the victims, and that is a scandal. At another hearing 7 months later, Weir criticized the Senate for being slow to gather more information about Kentler's experiment. We will not allow the government-sponsored pedestry to be swept under the rug. Two politicians from the Green Party, which has championed the rights of sexual minorities, accused the AFD of manipulating the victims. What the AFD is trying to do is instrumentalize this crime for its own purposes is unacceptable, a representative said. Schweer, the AFD advisor, tried to find a lawyer who could advocate for Marco in a civil lawsuit. I stand up for a friend, the victim of the so-called Kentler experiment, he wrote in an email to a large Berlin law firm. Marco had already filed a criminal complaint, but the investigation was limited because Hinkle had died in 2015. The lead caseworker, who retired after working for the office for more than 40 years, exercised his right to remain silent when the police contacted him. The public prosecutor, Norbert Winkler, concluded that Hinkle engaged in serious sexual assaults, including regular anal intercourse. But he could not find evidence that anyone at the office was complicit. The dilemma, he told me, was that whenever suspicions arose, the employees at the office relied on the claims from Mr. Kentler, who was at the time a very renowned person. Marco and Sven tried to file civil lawsuits against the state of Berlin in the Tempelhof-Schönberg district, the location of the Youth Welfare Office, for breach of official duties. But under civil law, too much time had passed. The AFD asked an expert to analyze whether the statute of limitations had to apply this case. Berlin's education senator Sandra Scheers, a member of the Social Democratic Party, wanted to see if Marco and Sven would accept a compensation package rather than pursue a lawsuit that seemed doomed. She believed the AFD was giving them bad advice, unnecessarily prolonging their attempt to get money. She told me, I found it quite strange how the AFD worked with the victims, how close their relationship was, and that they gave legal advice to them. Of course, it is okay if the AFD draws attention to injustices. But what happened here was uncommon. I've never experienced something like that. Weir, the AFD representative, told me, I would have been surprised if she had said anything nice about us. He believes there is still a pedophile network in Germany, and that those connected to it use their political influence to make sure the network remains under the radar. Marco went to visit one of Hinkle's foster sons from the first generation, as he put it, to see if he wanted to join his and Sven's legal efforts. The son, whom I'll call Samir, lived in Hinkle's house in Brandenburg, where the boys had spent summer vacations. The house, which had only one room, was made from beige bricks and seemed to have been assembled too casually. Uneven globs of mortar filled each crack. In photographs from the 90s, the place is a mess. A plastic bag and a half-eaten bread lie on the table. Outside the house, an old toaster oven with a badminton birdie lying next to it rests on a decaying dresser. Samir, who is 57 and a half Algerian, had not had contact with his birth family for more than 40 years. He had changed his last name to Hinkle and taken on a new German first name as well. His half-sister, who lives in Algeria, told me that she and her sister had tried many times to get in touch with him to no avail. He was the foster son whose interactions with Hinkle sparked a criminal investigation in 1979 when he was 15. At the time, psychologists had given Samir a personality test, and Samir had drawn himself as a fruit tree in the winter that lacks all contact to the nourishing earth. The psychologist interviewed Hinkle too and observed that he struggled to hold back his enormous, aggressive impulses, and though his foster sons tried to make up for something that he'd missed in his own past. Marco drove to Hinkle's old property and walked towards the house. 5-foot hedges now surrounded it. The windows were covered with blankets. Marco said, I wanted to offer him the opportunity to clear things up, like I had with Sven. But when I saw that no. Another foster brother, the first to move into Hinkle's home, lived a few miles away. But Marco decided there was no use in visiting him either. He walked back to his car and drove home. Winkler, the prosecutor, had sent investigators to Samir's home, and he described it as a garbage heap. There was no running water or electricity. There was barely even clear space to walk, yet one corner of the house was tidy and purposeful. It had been turned into a kind of altar. An urn with Hinkle's ashes was surrounded by fresh flowers. Hinkle had run his foster home for 30 years. When he finally shut it down in 2003, he hadn't been assigned a new foster child. Marco was 21. He had nowhere to live. He spent 3 nights sleeping on benches in the park with the help of a charity that assists homeless youths. He eventually moved into a subsidized apartment. He sometimes stole from grocery stores. I didn't know how the world functioned, he told me. I didn't even know that you need to pay for the electricity that comes out of the socket. He woke up several times in the middle of the night, a habit from his time caring for Marcel Kramer. But instead of going into his foster brother's room, he checked his own body to see, he said, if everything is still where it should be and that I still exist. He spent so much time by himself that he had trouble constructing sentences. Sven lived alone in a small apartment in Berlin too, but unlike Marco, he stayed in touch with Hinkle. I always thought I owed the man something, he told Der Spiegel in 2017. Marco and Sven lived as they always had as adolescents. They spent the day on the computer or watching TV, rarely speaking to anyone. Sven, who has experienced periods of severe depression since he was a child, still lives in what he's called a fortress of solitude, and he did not want to talk about his past. I don't have any more strength, he told me, but I can assure you that everything my brother told you about our time in the foster home is one-to-one the truth. Marco had also existed in a kind of hibernation, but after 5 years he felt as if he were becoming a monster, he said. It didn't quite go toward criminal actions, but there was a destructiveness, a lack of empathy. When he was 26, he was on a train in Berlin and noticed 3 men staring at him. Without making a conscious decision, Marco found himself beating them up. I should have said, "Hey, what are you looking at?" he said, but instead I immediately fought them. I noticed I actually wanted to kill them. One of the men ended up in the emergency room, and Marco realized how much this behavior resembled that of his foster father. It was a Henkel reaction, he said. I was a product. I was turning into the thing he had made. Around that time, he was walking on the street when a female photographer complimented his looks and asked if he'd like to do what Marco called hobby modeling. He agreed and sat for a series of photographs, adopting a variety of poses. In some pictures, he looks like a chiseled lawyer off to work. In others, he is windswept and preppy. The photographs never led to jobs, but he began hanging out with the photographer and her friends. He compared the experience to being a foreigner in an exotic country and finally meeting people who are willing to teach him the language. I learned normal ways of interacting, he said. The modeling work inspired him to get a haircut and to go to the hair salon. A glamorous woman with a sprightly, cheerful presence, whom I'll call Emma, trimmed his hair. Marco tends to credit his appearance for the pivotal events in his life. He believes his looks were the reason that Henkel chose him. Many of Henkel's sons had dark hair and eyes, and 20 years later, the explanation for his first serious relationship. I was pretty, and she didn't leave, he told me of Emma. He added, only partly joking, some women are just really into asshole types, and I was one of those asshole types. At first, he was resistant to our relationship, but gradually he found Emma's devotion persuasive. More than once, she slept outside his apartment door. I noticed that she really loves me, and that in life, there's probably only one person who comes along who will really fight for you, he said. He tried to be blunt his antisocial impulses by remembering that they were not innate, but he had been conditioned by his upbringing. I reprogrammed myself, so to speak, he said. I had to try to re-raise myself. When I visited Marco in May, he and Emma had just moved from Berlin to a new development on the city's outskirts that he asked me not to name or describe, because he didn't want his neighbors to know about his past. He now has 2 children, and they were playing with Emma in their large backyard. Inside, Marco listened to the meditative lounge music and drank water from the largest coffee mug I've ever seen. I had the sense that with a different childhood, Marco might have aged into a fairly jolly middle-aged man. He was playful and earnest and spoke poetically about his view of the afterlife. He shared his children's developmental milestones with nuance and pride. In a gust of hospitality, he asked if I wanted Emma to cut my hair before apologizing profusely and saying that my hair looked just fine. A few days before my visit, the Berlin Senate had announced that it would commission scholars at the University of Hildesheim who had published the preliminary report in 2020 to do a follow-up report about the pedophile-run foster homes in other parts of Germany. Sander Shears, the senator for education, had apologized to Marco and Sven, and the Senate offered them more than 50,000 euros. In Germany, where compensation for damages is much lower than it is in the United States, this was seen as a significant amount. Christoph Schwier, the AfD advisor, had urged Marco and Sven to keep fighting, but Marco couldn't understand why. We have gotten our wishes, so there's no point in further irritating or tyrannizing the Senate, he told me. But Schwier kept pushing him, Marco said. Schwier denies this. Then I slowly got suspicious. I asked myself, what else should I want? That's when I got the feeling that the AfD just wants to use me, to play me up. And I said, I don't want to be a political tool. I don't want to get pulled into an election campaign. He dropped his lawsuit and accepted the Senate's offer. His only remaining goal is that in the upcoming report, all of the names of the people involved in carrying out Kettler's experiment be revealed. Schwier said that he had been supporting Marco as a private person, not on behalf of the AfD. He also told me, I have new ideas, but for Marco, it's over. Marco and Emma were getting married at the end of the month, and he didn't want to think about his past. I just wanted to end the whole thing, to have this chapter closed, he said. He planned to take Emma's last name. He hadn't spoken with his birth parents or his brother since he was 10, and now he would become nearly untraceable. He had tried to Google his brother once, but he considered the idea of a reunion to be a waste of emotional resources that he could devote to his children. It wouldn't bring me anything anyway, he said. The period of being shaped by my mother is over. At the end of my visit, Marco's wedding ring arrived in the mail, and Emma shrieked with joy, but Marco held the ring in his hand dispassionately and joked that he had to marry eventually, so he might as well do it now. He disguised his obvious tenderness toward her with a show of indifference that Emma apparently knew not to take seriously. These are just a few deficits that I have, he said, referring to the lack of emotion. I'll get through it. It doesn't matter. 3 weeks later, on the eve of his wedding, he emailed me. In an hour around 10 a.m., we will drive to the registry office, he wrote. Symbolically, a new life begins. I'm sorry. I have to take pause. Because there is an important person in my life who experienced things as a child, and reading these last two paragraphs, it resonated with me. Emma resonates with me, is what I mean to say. So forgive me, because it actually made me a little bit emotional to read that. After leaving Henkel's home, Marco had contact with him only 2 times. The first time, when Marco was in his mid-20s, Henkel suddenly called. He appeared to have developed some sort of dementia. He asked if Marco had remembered to feed their rabbits. The next time was in 2015, when Emma was pregnant with their first child. Marco drove to a clinic in Brandenburg where he'd heard that Henkel was in hospice, dying of cancer. Marco opened the door to Henkel's room. He saw Henkel lying in the bed, groaning in pain. He had a long, wizard-like beard and looked to Marco as if he were possessed. Marco gazed at him for less than 5 seconds, long enough to confirm that he was actually dying. Then he turned around, closed the door, and walked out of the hospital. After Marco got home, the radio in the kitchen was playing, but he didn't remember having it turned on. A singer repeated the phrase, "I'm sorry," and he felt as if Henkel were trying to get in touch with him. I became a little bit crazy, he told me. I thought Henkel was a ghost who was following me, haunting me. It was definitely him. He was trying to apologize. Henkel died the next day. Marco entered a state of grief so fluid and expansive that, for the first time, he cried over the death of his foster brother, Marcel Kramer. He had lain in bed with Kramer for an hour after he died, holding a kind of vigil. Then he cut off one of Kramer's curls, so that he'd have something to remember him by. But he had never properly mourned him. Suddenly, the blockage disappeared, he said. He realized why he hadn't left Henkel's home when he turned 18. I was bound to the family by Marcel Kramer, he said. I would never have left him behind. A few weeks after Henkel's death, the sense of being haunted began to recede. The freedom came slowly, Marco told me. It was like a hunger that grows stronger and stronger. I don't know how to say it, but it was the first time that I figured out that I am living a life with a billion different possibilities. I could have been anything. My inner voice became stronger, my intuition that I don't have to live my life the way he taught me, that I can keep going. And that is the end of this article written by Rachel Aviv. So let's unpack all of what we've just read. So why did we read that entire article? Because I wanted for us to understand the individual that led the experiment that Volkmar Sigues was a part of. This was an experiment that he backed. And what we're going to do now is take a look at a couple of things that Sigues said back in 2011. And this is in an article with Spiegel International. And I'm going to start it in the middle because we're going to get into his perspective of pedophilias, okay? So we're going to look at one more article and then we're going to wrap things up today. Spiegel asks, how do websites like YouPorn, which is viewed by millions, change sexuality? Sigues, it's part of the neo-sexual revolution that began in the late 1970s and continues to this day. A key feature of this revolution is the large-scale publication and commercialization of details that were once secret. Sexuality has been trivialized. The interesting thing about this is that exaggerated portrayals apparently destroy desire more effectively than any repression. Spiegel, can YouPorn help reduce feelings of sexual guilt? Sigues, only superficially, but for people who are desperate and searching, sexuality on the internet offers an incredible release. In the past, every pervert believed that he was the only one who had an abstruse desire. Today, he can find it out on the internet that it's there and there's someone like him in New Zealand or Patagonia. On the other hand, internet sexuality shows that we're becoming more and more self-involved. I'm talking about self-sex. Spiegel, how does it affect the sexual development of adolescents when they can experience sex on the internet before having it themselves? Sigues, while the internet generally tends to have a stress-relieving function for adults, as long as they aren't inclined towards sex addiction, I don't see this as being the case for adolescents. Most pornographic images are simply too repulsive. Besides, secrets are destroyed that are central to the experience of love. But most young people seem to be behaving very intelligently. They look at things once in a while, but then they find it so idiotic and uncool that they just look away again. That is, provided they're not growing up in a family in which a drunk father is already watching pornos in the morning. Spiegel, what will sexuality look like in the future? Sigues, there will be other forms in addition to our classic marriage. One is already looming on the horizon, polyamory, or having more than one intimate partner. In other words, you're married to a woman who has no objection to another woman joining in the couple. Then she brings in her boyfriend. Suddenly you realize, my God, you can love more than one person. In fact, you can love several people at the same time. Spiegel, isn't that exhausting? Sigues, no one has to choose this option. It's just one of the many possibilities. We will experience a broader spectrum of socially accepted forms of sexual life. Incidentally, I have the utmost respect for people who are asexual. I didn't believe that they existed at first, but they do exist, and their numbers are growing. Spiegel, asexuality contradicts the modern promise of happiness, which holds that a fulfilled and exciting sexuality is part of a successful life. Sigues, this promise of happiness can also be a fatal burden, so that sexuality is pushed back more and more and people try to replace what they've lost with other forms of excitement. There are young men who want thrills but no longer value sex, so they do completely different things, including aggressive things. Spiegel, what do you see to be the biggest taboo in sexuality today? Sigues, clearly child sexuality, including everything that goes with it, pedophilia, pedosexuality. Spiegel, can these forms of sexuality be treated with therapy? Sigues, it's very important to approach pedophiles and pedosexuals and offer them therapy. It's been my experience that you can reach your objective with what I would call a kind-hearted, informed, and enlightened patience, in a sense that they don't lose their desire, but that they no longer have physical contact with children. That would be the goal. Spiegel, it sounds like you believe there's a group of perpetrators or pedophiles that aren't reachable through therapy. Sigues, yes, there is. That's been my experience. They can't be reached with offers of therapy. They are pedosexuals, who, even if the court forces them to go into treatment, do not pursue it or cannot pursue it. There have also been cases in which I was completely deceived as a therapist, in which the police would suddenly discover recent photographs of children while conducting a search. Spiegel, how should society treat these people? Sigues, in accordance with the law, there is no other way to answer the question. We are all potential murderers, and we are all potential rapists and abusers. Spiegel, more than 4 years ago when you retired, the Frankfurt-based Institute for Sexual Sciences was closed. Since then, you've been fighting a rather unpromising fight to at least preserve a professorship of sexual medicine and your outpatient center. Sigues, I think it's downright intolerable. Over the decades, we, and here I'm also referring to German sexologists Martin Dannecker and Raimund Reich, have studied such diverse topics as youth sexuality, homosexuality, gender tension, and transsexuality. We established sexual science between medicine and sociology. Society still needs this crazy discipline. The traits of our sexual culture are still speechlessness, loneliness, violence, and not enough desire and love. Spiegel, as a therapist, are you ever surprised by anything anymore? Sigues, yes, again and again, and it makes me very happy. Take, for example, the so-called objectophiles, who fall in love with and desire inanimate objects, like a machine or an instrument. Just ask 100 men with whom they spend more time with or who they love more, their wife or their new car. Just go to an auto show and you'll see all the signs of sexual arousal in men: shiny eyes, tremors, sex flush, an acute example of the need for a professional sex research. And I'm going to stop there. Oh, actually, hold on. There's one more thing I'm going to read for you. Spiegel, how exactly do you define good sex? Sigues, that's where I agree with Woody Allen. Good sex can be anything, including dirty. I probably could have literally used that quote. That's where I agree with Woody Allen. Good sex can be anything, including dirty. I think that would probably sum up Volkmar Sigues completely. All right, so let's wrap everything up in a nice little bow, shall we? Cisgender came 3 years after the 1991 Cissexual, and both mean to identify as the gender in which you were born. I cannot sit here and believe wholeheartedly that Dana DeFost did not come across the terminology cissexual when she was doing her research. I do not believe that. I absolutely don't believe that she wasn't looking into world-renowned sexologists and the terminology they used when doing the research and defining cisgender. Cisgender and cissexual are the same things. Knowing that, in my opinion, cissexual takes precedence over cisgender, which is just a rebranding of the term coined by a man who worked on an experiment in which multiple children, dozens, if not hundreds of children, were placed into pedophiles' homes intentionally and were ruined for it. Their entire childhood was ruined for it. And not everyone would end up growing up like Marco. So Volkmar Sigues, who was working with Kentler on that German experiment, and then we read what he has to say in those bits of the Spiegel interview, right? And it disturbed me because I truly believe he was trying to normalize minor attracted persons and saying, oh, well, we should just, keep them away from the children and it'll be fine. Why else would he say this other than knowing from his study, knowing what Kentler did, knowing who Kentler was, right? Knowing these things. And I don't believe he referenced Kentler when he talked about the other two German sexologists because he wanted to dissociate himself from Kentler. That is my belief. That interview specifically didn't mention Kentler because he knew at the end of the day that someone was going to say something, and they did just a few years later. We read about that in the article together. Cis is absolutely 100% rooted in an ideology that is part of pedophilia, and the fact that the sexual revolution in Germany was used as a way to separate itself from fascism. And it went so far that it actually was just enabling these ideals. And gender ideology is, they like to scream, oh, you're fascist, you're fascist, you're fascist, right? But they're using ideals that are fascist. So we have fascism, sexual revolution, gender ideology. These are intertwined. And there really is like this cult ideology, borderline religious, which, by the way, I think we're going to discuss the latest religious developments of the cult next week. There are some interesting worship studies that I've seen going on, or church mass where they literally sing to the they, them God, and they worship the flag. I'm not even lying to you. It is weird. It's weird. The cult is progressing into a religious status. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this episode. This is a very long episode, and it was an intense episode, to say the least. If you haven't already, make sure that you hit the like button and subscribe. Make sure to go to my Linktree and follow all of my other socials so you don't lose me. And I'm working on uploading these to Rumble, and also working on getting the Patreon up and running and setting stuff up for there as well. Navigate to exposingthecult.com if you want to buy merch to support me. I would greatly appreciate it. And as always, I am grateful to you, and I will see you on the next one.